What happens when the most powerful people in the world have something to hide? Picture the gleaming crowns, the opulent palaces, the velvet robes dripping with jewels, all symbols of absolute power, of dynasties built to last for centuries. But behind these magnificent facades lies a truth far more fascinating. The secrets royal families guarded so fiercely didn't just fuel court whispers. They ignited revolutions, crumbled thrones, and redrew the maps of history itself. We often think of royal scandals as mere gossip, tantalizing tales whispered over tea. But what if I told you that these hidden truths held more power than armies? That a single concealed letter, a hidden affair, or a covered-up crime could destabilize nations and rewrite the destiny of millions. This isn't just about secrets, it's about how silence can roar louder than cannon fire. Welcome, friends, to a journey into the shadows of power through candle-lit corridors where whispers decided fates, across battlefields where lies sparked wars, and into chambers where one confession could have saved or shattered an empire. Over the centuries, kings and queens, emperors and empresses faced moments where truth threatened everything they ruled over. And in those moments, they made choices to conceal, to deceive, to erase, that would ripple through generations. We're about to explore 25 royal secrets so explosive, so earth-shattering that they didn't just shock the world. They shook entire kingdoms to their very foundations. From illicit love affairs that altered bloodlines to political betrayals that toppled crowns, these aren't just stories. They're turning points in history, human dramas wrapped in silk and sealed with wax. So settle in and prepare to see history in a new light, not as a dry list of dates and treaties, but as a living, breathing tale of ambition, fear, and the breathtaking cost of power. This is about the moments when the fate of nations balanced on a secret, and how, in the end, not even the most guarded truth could stay buried forever. You're about to witness how palace walls have ears, how thrones have cracks, and how sometimes the most carefully constructed lies become the very things that bring empires crashing down. Let's begin. In the chilling pre-dawn hours of July 17, 1918, in a cramped basement room in Yekaterinburg, the unthinkable happened. The last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries, a brutal act meant to extinguish the Romanov dynasty forever. The world was told of the Tsar's death, but for years the official Soviet story was shrouded in deliberate mist. They claimed only the Tsar had been killed, seeding a potent rumor that one or more of the children, the 4 Grand Duchesses and the young hemophiliac Tsarevich, Alexei, might have miraculously escaped the slaughter. This was not just a cover-up, it was a calculated political move, a way to prevent the royal family from becoming martyrs around whom counter-revolutionary forces could rally. But from that manufactured ambiguity, a legend was born, one that would captivate the world for most of the 20th century. And at the very heart of it was a mysterious, traumatized young woman pulled from a Berlin canal in 1920. She refused to give her name, and when she finally did speak, she made an astonishing claim. She was Anastasia, the youngest Grand Duchess, the bubbly and mischievous daughter of the Tsar who had somehow survived the massacre. The woman the world came to know as Anna Anderson was a compelling figure, frail, emotionally volatile, yet possessing an uncanny knowledge of the Romanovs' private life and a striking physical resemblance to the lost Duchess. Her story ignited a firestorm of hope and controversy. For decades, she was the focal point of an international obsession. Those who wanted to believe in a fairy tale escaped from the revolution's violence rallied to her cause, while the surviving Romanov relatives and exiled aristocrats were bitterly divided, some denouncing her as a fraud, others becoming convinced she was the real Anastasia. Her court battles for recognition became a global spectacle, fueling the dreams of monarchists who saw her as a living symbol of the old regime, a key that could potentially unlock a restored Russia. Her story was so powerful it inspired plays, novels, and ultimately a beloved animated film, etching the idea of her survival deep into our cultural consciousness. Yet the truth, when it finally emerged with cold, scientific certainty, was far more final and far more tragic. The secret the Soviets had buried in a shallow grave outside Yekaterinburg could not stay hidden forever. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the remains of the Romanov family were exhumed and subjected to modern DNA analysis. The results were conclusive. The entire imperial family, Tsar Nicholas, Tsarina Alexandra, and all 5 of their children had perished in that basement. Anna Anderson's claims, which had held the world in thrall for over half a century, were definitively debunked. Genetic testing proved she was in fact a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska. The mystery that had shaken monarchies, fueled hopes, and inspired countless stories was in the end a profound and deeply human tragedy. The real secret wasn't a survival, it was the full, horrifying extent of the crime, a truth so explosive it had to be hidden for generations. Yet, even as the Romanov mystery was finally laid to rest by science, another centuries-old secret, one just as dark and shrouded in intrigue, continues to haunt the English imagination. We travel now from the bloody basement in Russia to the cold, stone confines of the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal decades-long civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, had finally seemingly ended with a Yorkist victory. The throne was secure under the charismatic King Edward IV, but when Edward died unexpectedly at just 40 years old, the peace shattered overnight. His heir, 12-year-old Edward V, and his younger brother, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, were placed in the Tower of London, not as prisoners but under the official pretext of preparing for the young king's coronation. Their protector was their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. What happened next is a masterclass in political power grabs. Richard swiftly moved to have his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville declared invalid, rendering all their children illegitimate and thus ineligible for the crown. The 2 boys, the rightful king and his heir, were suddenly mere obstacles. They were seen less and less frequently playing in the Tower Gardens, and then they were seen not at all. They simply vanished from history, leaving behind only a chilling question and an uncle who now crowned himself King Richard III. The accusation of murder was almost immediate. Richard's contemporaries, and most famously the Tudor historians who followed him, had no doubt. They painted Richard as a monstrous hunchback, a man so consumed by ambition that he would order the deaths of his own innocent nephews to secure his rule. This narrative was cemented by William Shakespeare, whose brilliant but brutally biased play portrayed Richard as a villainous, scheming fiend crying out, "I am determined to prove a villain." The secret of the prince's fate became the foundational stone of the Tudor dynasty's propaganda, justifying Henry VII's defeat of Richard at the Battle of Bosworth and his own claim to the throne. But here's where the secret deepens into a true historical labyrinth. There was never a confession, no eyewitness account, and no bodies were produced as evidence. The lack of concrete proof has fueled centuries of debate. Could they have been secretly killed on the orders of someone else? Perhaps the powerful Duke of Buckingham, who later turned against Richard, or could they have even been secretly smuggled away to safety, dying in obscurity years later? The mystery was tantalizingly fed in 1674 when workmen at the tower discovered a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children buried beneath a staircase. King Charles II, convinced they were the princes, had them interred in a grand urn in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today. Modern science has only added more layers to the enigma. Those bones were examined in 1933 and were consistent with the ages of the princes, but the analysis was inconclusive and permission for modern DNA testing has been persistently denied. So the secret remains locked away, not in stone but in bone and politics. This single, unresolved act of regicide, or perhaps non-regicide, has forever shaped the legacy of a king. Richard's reputation, damned for 500 years, has found fervent defenders in modern times, the Richard III Society arguing passionately for a re-evaluation of a monarch they believe was slandered by his conquerors. The fate of the princes in the Tower is more than a cold case. It is the original sin of English history, a propaganda war that began in the 15th century and continues to this very day, proving that some secrets never truly die, they just change sides. While the fate of the princes remained a ghost haunting English history, in France a century later, a very different kind of secret emerged, one not of a single crime, but of a widespread sickness festering in the very heart of Europe's most glorious court. We arrive now at the Palace of Versailles in the late 1670s, the dazzling, suffocating world of Louis XIV, the Sun King. This was the epicenter of absolute power, a gilded cage where hundreds of aristocrats lived under the king's watchful eye, their lives a meticulously staged performance of etiquette, fashion, and ferocious ambition. But beneath the surface of this exquisite ballet, a toxic undercurrent was flowing. A secret network of fortune-tellers, midwives, and alchemists known as divineresses operated in the shadows of Paris and the back corridors of Versailles itself. To the bored, desperate, and power-hungry members of the court, these women offered a dangerous menu of services, from harmless-seeming love potions to secure a lover's affection, to far more sinister concoctions known as powders de succession, inheritance powders. These were, in plain terms, poisons, often arsenic-based, designed to discreetly remove a problematic husband, a wealthy relative, or a romantic rival. What began as a grubby criminal trade soon spiraled into an affair that threatened to consume the throne itself. The scandal, which would become known as l'affaire des poisons, exploded into the open following a series of arrests and the desperate confessions of a famous poisoner named Lavoisin. Under torture, she began to name names, astonishingly high-ranking names. The investigation was handed over to a special, secret tribunal called the Chamber Ardente, the burning chamber, named for the fiery torches that lit its proceedings. Its findings were more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The web of accusations ensnared dozens of nobles, and then it reached the king's inner circle. The most shocking allegation of all implicated the woman who had been the king's powerful mistress for years, Madame de Montespan. According to testimonies, Montespan, fearing she was losing the king's favor to a younger rival, had not only purchased love potions to maintain his affection, but had also participated in black masses performed over her own naked body, using the blood of sacrificed infants to consecrate blasphemous petitions for the king's love. Even more chillingly, she was accused of plotting to administer a poisoned petition to the king himself. The image was utterly shattering, the Sun King's own mistress, the mother of his children, dabbling in black magic and allegedly conspiring to murder him. For Louis, this was no longer a criminal matter. It was an existential threat to the very foundation of his power. His reign was built on the concept of the divine right of kings, the belief that he was God's anointed ruler on earth. How could that divine image survive if the public learned that his own bed had been touched by satanic rituals and assassination plots? The scandal had the potential to utterly demolish the monarchy's sacred prestige, transforming it from a godly institution into a nest of corruption and devil worship. So the Sun King made a ruthless decision. He suppressed it. The Chamber Ardente was abruptly shut down in 1682, its records sealed and later burned. Key witnesses, including Lavoisin, were executed quickly, and other accused nobles were either exiled or imprisoned for life without trial, their names and crimes erased from public discourse. Madame de Montespan was never formally charged, but she was quietly dismissed from court, her power and reputation extinguished overnight. Louis XIV chose to protect the myth of the monarchy at all costs, even if it meant allowing poisoners to go unpunished and burying a secret that revealed his court to be a viper's nest. He prioritized the stability of his throne over absolute justice, proving that in the calculus of power, sometimes the most dangerous truth is not the crime but the public's knowledge of it. The affair of the poisons demonstrates the extreme length to which a ruler would go to control his own narrative, sacrificing truth on the altar of prestige, leaving a permanent stain on the legacy of the world's most brilliant court. Yet for all her defiance of convention, one question has tantalized historians for centuries. Did this queen, who so publicly rejected the expectations of marriage and motherhood, secretly experience it after all? The whispers began during her time in Rome and have never fully ceased, suggesting that Christina may have had one or even two illegitimate children. The most persistent rumor points to a secret pregnancy in 1656, not long after her abdication, with the child allegedly given up immediately to avoid a cataclysmic scandal. The potential father is often speculated to have been her close confidant and the master of her household, Cardinal Decio Azzolino, with whom she shared an intense and lifelong bond that blurred every line between the spiritual and the romantic. Their relationship was the talk of Europe. They exchanged over 1,500 incredibly intimate letters filled with passionate declarations. Christina signed them with phrases like "your slave," while Azzolino, a powerful figure in the Catholic Church, risked his entire career for his devotion to her. They were inseparable in Rome, their closeness a source of endless speculation. For a queen who had so vehemently rejected marriage, a hidden pregnancy would have been the ultimate contradiction, a personal secret with devastating political ramifications. Had such a child been formally recognized as hers, it would have instantly created a monumental succession crisis back in Protestant Sweden. Her enemies, who already saw her conversion as the ultimate betrayal, would have wielded this secret as the ultimate proof of her depravity and unsuitability to have ever ruled. A Catholic heir born out of wedlock to a cardinal no less would have been a political weapon of mass destruction, invalidating her entire reign and likely plunging Sweden into internal conflict over the legitimacy of her line. This leads to a fascinating possibility that her abdication was not merely an act of personal freedom or religious conviction, but a brilliantly calculated move to protect herself and her secrets from ever being exposed under the blinding spotlight of the throne. By stepping down, she removed herself from the constant scrutiny of a Protestant court, granting herself the liberty to live as she wished in the shadow of the Vatican. Her fierce resistance to ever marrying or naming a successor takes on a new dimension if she was, in fact, protecting the existence of a child who could never legally claim the crown. In the end, the truth of Queen Christina's possible motherhood remains locked within her private letters, most of which were deliberately destroyed by Azzolino after her death, a final act of protection for a woman who built her entire life on the tension between glorious revelation and powerful, world-shaking secrecy. But while Queen Christina's secrets were a matter of passionate personal defiance, our next royal scandal reveals a far more calculated and legally perilous game, one that pitted the heart of a future king directly against the cold, unyielding letter of the law. We journey now to late 18th century England, to the extravagant and deeply unpopular court of George III. His eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, was the rock star of his day, charismatic, deeply in debt, and a slave to his own appetites. And in 1784, he became utterly obsessed with a woman who represented everything he, as the heir to the Protestant throne, was forbidden to have, a twice-widowed commoner Catholic named Maria Fitzherbert. Their courtship was a whirlwind of passion and drama, culminating in the prince faking a suicide attempt to convince Maria of his desperate love. She was a woman of profound principle and faith, and she held a line that seemed immovable: she would not become his mistress. The only way she would ever be with him was as his wife. This presented the prince with an impossible choice. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed by his own father, was brutally clear. Any descendant of George II under the age of 25 required the sovereign's consent to marry. Anyone who entered into such a marriage without that consent would find the union legally null and void, and the penalty was even more severe for marrying a Catholic. The Act of Settlement of 1701 stipulated that anyone who shall profess the popish religion or shall marry a papist would be excluded from the succession entirely. For the Prince of Wales to marry Maria Fitzherbert wasn't just reckless, it was an act of political self-immolation that would cost him the crown. Yet on December 15, 1785, in the drawing room of Maria's rented house on Park Street in London, that is precisely what he did. A lone Anglican priest, the Reverend Robert Burt, was bribed and perhaps threatened into performing the ceremony, which was witnessed by only a handful of the prince's most reckless companions. A marriage certificate was signed, and the prince presented Maria with a ring featuring a lock of his hair under a table of crystal. In the eyes of God and their own hearts, they were man and wife. But in the eyes of the law, it was a complete fiction, a dangerous secret that placed a time bomb right at the heart of the British monarchy. The cover-up began instantly. Maria was never presented at court, and they were forced to maintain an elaborate public charade, a torturous performance where the woman he considered his legal wife had to be treated in public as merely his favorite mistress. The strain was immense. Whispers of the marriage swirled through London society for years, fueled by the prince's own careless boasts to friends and the sheer impossibility of their situation. The secret finally threatened to explode into the open during the Regency crisis of 1788, when King George III suffered his first devastating bout of madness. Parliament was forced to debate establishing a regency for the Prince of Wales. His political opponents, led by the formidable Charles James Fox, were terrified that a regent under the influence of a Catholic wife would be a national catastrophe. Pressed in the House of Commons, Fox, likely on direct orders from the prince himself, rose and categorically denied the marriage ever took place, denouncing the rumors as low, malicious falsehoods. It was a breathtaking public betrayal. Maria was horrified, humiliated that the man she had risked everything for would so blatantly deny her existence and their sacred vows. The denial shattered the fragile trust between them, and though they would reconcile and even continue their relationship on and off for years, the magic of their secret union was forever broken. The prince's eventual official marriage to his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick, in 1795, was a cynical, state-sanctioned transaction designed purely to pay off his enormous debts with a parliamentary grant. He famously found Caroline so repulsive he was drunk throughout the wedding ceremony and had to be physically supported to say his vows. He returned to Maria the very next day, but the damage was done. Their secret marriage was now permanently overshadowed by a public, legal one. The enduring power of this secret was proven decades later. After George had become King George IV and both he and Maria were elderly, he sent messengers to her home demanding the return of the marriage certificate, desperate to destroy the evidence before he died. Maria, with a quiet dignity that had eluded the king his entire life, refused. She safeguarded that piece of paper not for leverage but as proof that her honor and her faith had been intact throughout their tumultuous affair. She outlived him, and the certificate survived as well, a tangible relic of a love that dared to challenge the very constitution of a nation. This was not just a hidden romance, it was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't buried in a basement or whispered in a poisoner's den. They are written on a marriage certificate, signed by a prince, and hidden in a drawer, forever threatening to shake the foundations of a kingdom. But the secret illness of a king is more than a medical mystery. It is a political earthquake. The most terrifying episodes coincided with some of the most critical moments in British and world history. His first major attack in 1788 came as Parliament was debating the Regency Bill, a direct response to his incapacitation. His ministers, led by the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, were forced into a desperate and continuous act of concealment. They downplayed the severity of his symptoms, attributing his bizarre behavior to a bilious fever or simple overwork, all to prevent power from passing to the Prince of Wales, who was politically aligned with their opponents. The stability of the entire government hinged on maintaining the fiction that the king was merely temporarily unwell, that he would inevitably return to his senses. This was a secret kept not in a diary but in the corridors of power, a conspiracy of silence designed to protect the nation from the shocking truth that its divinely appointed ruler was, for all intents and purposes, gone. This crisis of concealment reached its peak during the king's final and most tragic descent into permanent madness after 1810. By then, an entire nation was in on the secret they pretended not to know. Cartoons depicted the king as a babbling old man strapped into a restraining chair in the secluded rooms of Windsor Castle. The government could no longer hide the truth, and the Regency Act of 1811 finally made his son, the future George IV, Prince Regent. But the damage was done. For decades, the British Empire had been governed by a shadow, its real power vacuum filled by squabbling ministers and a profligate heir. The king's secret illness didn't just cause personal suffering. It fundamentally altered the course of British governance during the Napoleonic Wars, created a deep public distrust of the monarchy, and established a precedent for dealing with royal incapacity that would echo for centuries. The Mad King was not a simple figure of pity or ridicule. He was the vulnerable human center of a constitutional storm, a monarch whose most intimate biological secret became a matter of state security, shaking the very foundations of the world's most powerful empire. While the madness of King George forced England to confront the fragility of its ruler's mind, another royal house in Europe was being physically unmade by a secret it carried in its very bloodline. For centuries, the Habsburgs were not just a family, they were an institution, a political machine that ruled over vast swaths of Europe through a simple, brutal motto: "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." Their power was built on strategic unions, weaving a web of alliances that stretched from Spain to Hungary. But this obsession with keeping power within the family had a terrible physical cost, one that was hidden in plain sight on the faces of its emperors and kings. It was Europe's worst-kept secret, the Habsburg jaw. This distinctive feature, known medically as mandibular prognathism, was a pronounced forward-thrusting jaw and lower lip that made it difficult to speak clearly or even chew food properly. And it grew more pronounced with each generation. You can see its progression in their official portraits, a gallery of power slowly being consumed by deformity. Look at a painting of Charles V in the 16th century, and you see a strong, determined man with a slightly prominent chin. Move forward 100 years to Philip IV of Spain, and the jaw is undeniable, a heavy, awkward feature dominating his face. This wasn't just a quirky family trait, it was a genetic marker, a bill coming due for centuries of intermarriage. The Habsburgs, in their drive to consolidate power, had turned their family tree into a tangled knot of first cousins, uncles marrying nieces, and double first cousins marrying each other. They were slowly poisoning their own bloodline, and the jaw was the undeniable physical proof. But this secret of inbreeding reached its horrific final form in one tragic figure, Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, he was the culmination of generations of calculated unions. His own parents were uncle and niece. In fact, his family's coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of how closely related his parents were, was higher than if his own brother and sister had had a child. The result was a child and then a man so ravaged by genetic disorders that he was a living testament to the dynasty's folly. He was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His lower jaw jutted out so severely that his teeth did not meet, making it impossible for him to chew his food and leading to chronic drooling. He couldn't walk properly until he was 8 years old, and his speech was barely intelligible. He suffered from epileptic fits and was plagued by a host of other illnesses, believed to have included a combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis. Perhaps most crucially for a king, he was intellectually disabled and completely incapable of ruling. His courtiers essentially ran the country while he spent his days playing with toy soldiers or visiting the tombs of his ancestors, asking when they would come to life. And then there was the matter of the succession. He was married twice to attractive, capable women, but he was almost certainly impotent and unable to produce an heir. This was the great, unspoken secret that every court in Europe understood but could not officially acknowledge. The mighty Spanish Habsburg line, which had once bestrode the continent like a colossus, was about to end. It would die not on a battlefield, but in a sick, the victim of its own toxic obsession with blood purity. Charles's eventual death in 1700 created a power vacuum that threatened to tear Europe apart. The secret was out. The Grand Habsburg inheritance, Spain itself, its territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and its vast American empire was now up for grabs. The two most powerful families in Europe, the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs, both had claims through Charles's sisters. The prospect of either France or Austria absorbing the Spanish Empire and upsetting the continental balance of power was utterly terrifying to nations like England and the Dutch Republic. The secret that everyone had known for decades, that the Spanish Habsburgs were a biological dead end, now exploded into the open, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession, a devastating 13-year global conflict that drew in all the great powers. Millions would die in a war fought over the corpse of a dynasty that had been destroyed from within, a chilling lesson that the most dangerous secrets are not always whispered in dark corners. Sometimes they are written on the face of a king for all the world to see. While the fate of the Spanish Habsburgs was a tragedy written in the open, our next secret is the absolute opposite, a man whose entire existence was so dangerous it had to be erased from the world, his very face hidden from history. Imagine a prisoner of the highest possible status, shuffled between France's most formidable fortresses for over 3 decades. His accommodations were comfortable, even privileged. He was well fed and treated with a strange, deferential respect by his jailers. But he was never, ever allowed to remove the mask that covered his features. This wasn't the Iron Mask of Alexander Dumas's famous novel. That was a later, more dramatic invention. The reality, according to the meticulous records kept by his jailer at the Bastille, was a mask made of black velvet held in place by steel springs. Its purpose wasn't to cause discomfort, but to guarantee absolute anonymity. Who was this man, and what had he done that was so terrifying to the Sun King, Louis XIV, that he had to be hidden away, yet kept alive in such a uniquely bizarre fashion? The secrecy surrounding this prisoner was absolute and terrifying in its efficiency. His identity was known to only a handful of people at the very top of the French state. The governor of the Pignerolo prison, where he was first held, received his orders directly from the king's most powerful minister, and the instructions were chillingly clear. If the prisoner ever speaks to you of anything other than his immediate needs, you are to kill him. His jailers were forbidden from looking at him when they served his meals, and he was never to be addressed by any name. He was a non-person, a living ghost in the gilded prison of the French state. This level of obsessive concealment points to a secret of monumental importance, one that, if revealed, could potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. So who was he? The theories are numerous and fascinating, each with its own compelling logic. The most popular, first suggested by the philosopher Voltaire during his own stint in the Bastille, was that the prisoner was the king's illegitimate older brother, the son of Anne of Austria and her alleged lover, Cardinal Mazarin. If true, this man would have been a constant, living threat to Louis's legitimacy. Another theory posits he was the biological father of Louis XIV himself, suggesting that the real Sun King had died in infancy and been secretly replaced to ensure the succession, a secret so explosive that the man who knew it had to be permanently silenced. Other candidates include a disgraced general who knew too much about the king's humiliating foreign policy failures, or even a high-ranking nobleman who had committed the ultimate crime of laughing at one of the king's mistresses. But perhaps the most convincing theory points to a man named Eustache Dorger. Historical documents, including a letter from the king's minister, refer to a prisoner of that name who was to be held with extreme secrecy. Dorger's crime is believed to have been his involvement in a political scandal known as the Affair of the Poisons, the same dark episode that nearly ensnared Madame de Montespan. He may have been a lowly valet, but a valet who carried messages or knew secrets so damning about the highest members of the court, perhaps even about a plot against the king, that his knowledge made him the most dangerous man in France. His life was spared only because executing him would have risked his secrets being spoken aloud at the scaffold. It was safer to consign him to a living death, to bury him alive in a system of stone and silence. The genius of the man in the Iron Mask story is that its power doesn't come from a solved mystery, but from its enduring ambiguity. He became the ultimate symbol of the lettre de cachet, the king's arbitrary power to imprison anyone for any reason, without trial, without charges, and without appeal. He was living proof that under the glittering surface of absolute monarchy, there was a terrifying darkness. The public's fascination with this invisible prisoner grew over the decades, fueled by whispers and Voltaire's writings, transforming him from a man into a metaphor. He represented every subject who could be vanished by the state on the monarch's whim. This single, anonymous prisoner did more to fuel public distrust and revolutionary sentiment than 1,000 political pamphlets, because his story was a tangible, human-sized example of the absolute power that would, within a century, lead the French people to tear down the Bastille stone by stone, searching for their own ghosts in the walls. But as the Sun King's Iron Mask demonstrated, sometimes the greatest threat to a throne comes not from a hidden prisoner, but from the monarch's own heart. And no story in modern history proves this more dramatically than the one that unfolded in the winter of 1936, when the British Empire found itself held hostage to a king's reckless love. The new monarch, King Edward VIII, had been the popular Prince of Wales, a charismatic and modern figure who seemed to understand his subjects. But he carried a secret, one known to the highest echelons of government and the press barons who agreed to a voluntary blackout. He was deeply, irrevocably in love with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite who was in the process of ending her second marriage. To the king, she was everything. To the establishment, she was impossible. The crisis began not with a public declaration, but in a series of tense, secret meetings behind the oak-paneled doors of Buckingham Palace and 10 Downing Street. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin delivered the brutal, unchangeable facts to his king. The Church of England, of which Edward was the supreme governor, forbade the remarriage of divorced persons with living former spouses. The governments of the United Kingdom and the Dominions Canada, Australia, South Africa would never accept a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands as queen consort. The monarchy's sacred prestige, already shaken by the recent turmoil of the Great Depression, would not survive the scandal. Baldwin presented the only choices: give up Mrs. Simpson or give up the throne. Edward, defiant and romantic, believed he could modernize the institution and force its acceptance. He was wrong. The machinery of the state, the church, and the Constitution moved against him with quiet, immovable force. For months, the British public remained blissfully unaware, their newspapers silent on the affair, while the foreign press splashed the scandal across front pages worldwide. The secret was a ticking time bomb. The king's refusal to bend created the most severe constitutional crisis since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The stability of the crown itself seemed to hang in the balance, with whispers even of civil unrest or the king's ministers resigning en masse if he attempted to force a morganatic marriage, making Wallis his wife but not his queen. In the end, faced with the complete collapse of his constitutional role, Edward made his choice. In a radio broadcast heard around the world on December 11, 1936, he uttered the unforgettable words that would define his legacy. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." He abdicated, passing the crown to his unprepared younger brother, who became King George VI. But the secrets did not end with the abdication. They simply mutated into something darker. Almost immediately, the new Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they were titled, became subjects of intense and disturbing suspicion. Their well-documented social connections to high-ranking Nazi officials, including Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who had sent Wallace 17 roses every day while he was an ambassador in London, were now viewed through a terrifying new lens. The couple's infamous tour of Germany in 1937, where they met Adolf Hitler, gave full-throated Nazi salutes and were enthusiastically feted by the regime, confirmed the worst fears of many in British intelligence. Secret government files, only declassified decades later, reveal the depth of the concern. There were fears that the Nazis planned to reinstate Edward as a puppet king in London if Germany won the war. The couple's loose talk and perceived sympathies were considered such a liability that during the war, Edward was essentially exiled to the Bahamas as governor, a post designed to keep him as far from the action as possible, where he couldn't cause any more damage. What began as a personal, romantic secret that shook the Constitution evolved into a full-blown geopolitical scandal, a shadow of treason that would forever hang over the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Their story is the ultimate cautionary tale of how a monarch's private desire can collide with public duty, and how the pursuit of personal happiness can inadvertently open a door to threats that endanger not just a crown, but the entire free world. Just weeks after a magnificent banquet in Babylon, the seemingly invincible Alexander the Great, the man who had conquered the known world from Greece to India, was dead. He was only 32 years old. His final days were a horrifying spectacle of rapid physical decline, marked by a raging fever, excruciating pain, and a creeping paralysis that stole his voice and his strength. The official account, dutifully recorded by the court historian, pointed to a sudden illness, perhaps malaria or typhoid fever, exacerbated by a recent bout of heavy drinking and the accumulated wounds from a lifetime of brutal warfare. To many, it seemed a tragically mundane end for a figure of mythic proportions, but from the very moment his body began to cool, a powerful counter-narrative took root, one that refused to accept that fate or fever could fell a demigod. The secret whispered in the corridors of his palace and among his veteran soldiers was far more dramatic: assassination by poison. The prime suspects were not foreign enemies, but his own inner circle, the very generals who had fought beside him for a decade. Two names rose to the top of the list. The first was Cassander, the son of Alexander's trusted regent in Macedonia, Antipater. Cassander had recently arrived in Babylon and had publicly clashed with Alexander, who viewed the young nobleman with deep suspicion and outright disdain. The second suspect was Antipater himself, who was under orders to be replaced and may have acted to save his own power and life by ordering a preemptive strike through his son. The alleged methods of the poisoning read like a page from a sinister thriller. Some accounts suggest a poisoned cup of wine was presented to him during that final banquet, a plot orchestrated by his cup-bearer, Iolaus, who just so happened to be another son of Antipater. The most chilling theory points to a substance of legendary potency, water collected from the river Styx. In ancient Greek mythology, the Styx was the river of the underworld, and its water was said to be so lethally corrosive that it could eat through any earthly container. Historians speculate this could be a mythological description of a real, deadly toxin, perhaps a bacteria-laden water from a poisonous spring that was gathered in a hollowed-out mule's hoof and administered to the king. The symptoms Alexander exhibited: the acute pain, the violent convulsions, the slow paralysis, are disturbingly consistent with known ancient poisons like strychnine or white hellebore. Yet the most devastating consequence of his death was not the loss of the man, but the utter destruction of his dream. Alexander's entire colossal empire was a personal possession, held together solely by the force of his will and the awe of his presence. He had named no clear successor. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a secret power grab that succeeded beyond the plotter's wildest dreams, instantly creating a vacuum that his generals rushed to fill. The uncertainty surrounding the cause of death became the perfect fuel for 40 years of brutal civil war, as his former companions, the Diadochi, tore his empire to pieces in their scramble for power. The initial fragile agreement to rule jointly on behalf of Alexander's unborn son and his half-brother shattered almost immediately into open conflict. This single, unresolved secret natural death or murder effectively erased Alexander's life's work from the map, proving that the mystery surrounding a leader's end can often unleash far more chaos and destruction than the death itself. From the calculated abdication of a British king, we travel back to an era where the line between the sacred and the profane was not just blurred, it was systematically erased. If you think modern political dynasties are ruthless, prepare to enter the snake pit of Renaissance Italy, where one family turned the throne of St. Peter into a weapon for building a secular empire. This is the story of the Borgias, a name that became synonymous with treachery, poison, and the most brazen corruption the Catholic Church has ever seen. At the heart of this empire of sin was Rodrigo Borgia, a man of immense ambition and charm who, in 1492, used a massive fortune in bribes to buy the votes of his fellow cardinals and become Pope Alexander VI. From that moment, the Vatican was no longer the center of Christendom. It was the headquarters of a family business. The Borgias' secrets weren't hidden, they were flaunted. Their tools were simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and rampant, outrageous nepotism. Alexander immediately began elevating his children, granting them titles, wealth, and power. His son, Cesare, was made a cardinal at the age of 18, despite having no interest in the priesthood and a well-known reputation for cruelty and ambition. His daughter, Lucrezia, was famously used as a pawn in strategic marriages to cement political alliances. Each union negotiated and then annulled when it no longer served the family's ever-shifting goals. But their most terrifying and enduring secret weapon was rumored to be cantarella, a mysterious white poison whose recipe was said to be a Borgia family secret. Its name itself was a dark joke derived from the word cattivo, meaning bad, but playing on cane or dog, as it was allegedly tested on strays. Historians believe it was likely a compound of arsenic and possibly phosphorus or copper, which would produce symptoms eerily similar to the sudden, violent fevers and gastrointestinal agony that often struck down the Borgias' enemies. The method of delivery was the stuff of legend, hollow rings often bearing the family's bull crest, which could be discreetly twisted to release a dose into a rival's wine goblet during a seemingly friendly toast. This wasn't just a theory, it was an open secret in Rome. The death of Cardinal Giovanni Michiel in 1503 is a prime example. The wealthy cardinal was an obstacle to the Borgias' land ambitions. After dining with Cesare, he fell violently ill and died. His wealth and titles were promptly transferred to the family. So many cardinals and nobles who crossed the Borgias met similar fates that the Romans had a grimly humorous saying, "We are in the hands of the Borgias, and only God knows what will happen next." The family's audacity reached its peak at an event that has become the ultimate symbol of their decadence, the Banquet of the Chestnuts. According to the diary of the Master of Ceremonies, a servant of the Pope, the event was held in the Vatican's Apostolic Palace. After a lavish dinner, 50 courtesans were brought in and made to crawl on their hands and knees among the guests, picking up chestnuts scattered across the floor. Pope Alexander and his children, Lucrezia and Cesare, looked on from a balcony as the evening descended into an orgiastic spectacle. with prizes of fine silks and jewels awarded to the men who could perform the most acts with these women. This was not a hidden party, it was a very public demonstration of power, a message that the Borgias were above morality, above the law, and even above the basic tenets of the faith they were supposed to lead. The regime operated on a foundation of fear and intrigue, masterminded by the chillingly efficient Caesar, who was described by the diplomat Machiavelli as the ideal prince, ruthless, pragmatic, and utterly effective. Their secrets of assassination and immorality were known to all but proven by none, because to accuse the Pope was a death sentence. This systematic corruption did more than just advance one family's fortune. It fatally wounded the spiritual authority of the entire Catholic Church. Across Europe, pious Christians were horrified by the reports coming out of Rome. The Borgia papacy became the #1 exhibit for reformers like Martin Luther, who argued that the church was too corrupt to be saved from within and needed a complete overhaul. The Borgias' secrets, whispered in fear and recounted in outrage, didn't just eliminate their rivals. They helped fuel the theological and political fury that would soon explode as the Protestant Reformation, permanently fracturing Western Christianity and altering the course of world history. Their poison, both literal and metaphorical, seeped far beyond the marble halls of the Vatican, proving that the most damaging secrets are often the ones everyone knows, but no one in power dares to stop. Now we cross into a different kind of hidden history, one where myth and memory are so deeply intertwined they become inseparable. This is the secret not of a single person, but of an entire people, a kingdom that vanished so completely its only true legacy is a legend of a cursed treasure. Our story begins not in a palace, but in the mists of the 5th century along the mighty Rhine River, where a powerful Germanic tribe known as the Burgundians had established a formidable kingdom. Their capital was at Worms, and for a time they were a significant force in the chaotic power struggles that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But in the year 436, this entire kingdom was suddenly and brutally erased from the map. Historical records, though sparse, point to a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Huns, the terrifying nomadic empire led by the infamous Attila. The Roman general Aetius, who would later famously defeat Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, appears to have sanctioned or even encouraged the Hunnic attack on his Burgundian rivals. The result was a wholesale slaughter. Ancient sources claim 20,000 Burgundians were killed, including their king, Gundahar. It was a genocide, the complete and utter destruction of a nation. For centuries, this historical tragedy lived on only in the oral traditions of the Germanic peoples, a haunting memory of a glorious kingdom lost. Then, around the year 1200, an anonymous Austrian poet wove these ancient echoes into one of the most important works of German literature ever created, the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelung. In this epic poem, the Burgundians are transformed into the magnificent heroes of the court at Worms, led by the proud King Gunther. Their downfall comes through a series of betrayals centered on a vast, cursed treasure, the hoard of the Nibelungs. The legend tells of the dragon slayer Siegfried, who wins this gold and gives it to his wife Kriemhild as a bridal gift. After Siegfried is murdered by the treacherous Hagen, Kriemhild uses the treasure to build her own power base, waiting for the day she can exact her revenge. Fearing her influence, Hagen seizes the gold and, in the dead of night, takes it to the Rhine River, where he sinks it in a secret location. Murdering all the boatmen who helped him to ensure its hiding place dies with him. Years later, Kriemhild's vengeance is finally realized when she lures the Burgundians to the court of Attila the Hun, where a bloodbath ensues, ending with every last one of them dead. The treasure, however, remains at the bottom of the Rhine, its location lost, a cursed prize that brought nothing but death to all who possessed it or sought to conceal it. This is where history and myth perform their mesmerizing dance. The epic is a grand work of fiction, but its core, the sudden, violent eradication of the Burgundian kingdom by the Huns, is stark historical fact. The poem's King Gunther is a clear echo of the historical King Gundahar, who died in 436. The legendary Hagen's sinking of the treasure is a powerful metaphorical explanation for a very real historical mystery. What happened to the vast wealth of the Burgundian royal house? In the 5th century, a king's power was literally measured in gold tribute paid by Rome, loot from conquest, ceremonial gifts to loyal warriors. A kingdom as powerful as the Burgundians would have possessed a colossal royal treasury. And after their catastrophic defeat, that treasury vanished from history. It was never accounted for, never seized by the Huns, never mentioned again. It simply disappeared. This historical vacuum created the perfect space for a legend to grow. The idea of a sunken hoard was a narrative device to explain the unexplainable. Where did all the gold go? The legend provides the answer. It was hidden, and the man who hid it made sure the secret would die with him. For centuries, this wasn't just a story. It was a genuine historical mystery that captivated treasure hunters and archaeologists. The Rhine River, particularly a deep, swirling section known as the Lochmuhel Eddy near the town of Worms, has been scoured for clues. In the 19th century, a businessman financed a massive and ultimately fruitless dredging operation to find the hoard. Even Heinrich Himmler, head of the Nazi SS, became obsessed with the legend, funding archaeological expeditions to locate the treasure, which he saw as a sacred relic of the Germanic past. While no colossal cache of 5th century gold has ever been found, smaller archaeological discoveries have tantalizingly confirmed that the legend is built on a foundation of truth. The famous Petrosa treasure, a huge 4th century Roman gold hoard found in Romania, shows the staggering scale of wealth that was in circulation and could be hidden. More poignantly, in the 1960s, construction workers in Worms uncovered a spectacular Burgundian prince's grave from the exact period of the kingdom's destruction. The warrior was buried with an incredible suite of gold and garnet jewelry, a solid gold bull's head bracelet, and a ring that bore the inscription Hare Hare, a name possibly linked to the legendary Hagen himself. This was not the Nibelung treasure, but it was a king's ransom, proving that the legendary wealth was not a complete fantasy. The secret of the Nibelungenlied is therefore a dual one. On one level, it is the historical mystery of a lost royal treasury, a secret that sank to the bottom of the Rhine 1500 years ago. On a far deeper level, it is the secret of how history processes trauma. The annihilation of the Burgundians was a cataclysm so profound that it could not be forgotten. The human mind, through generations of storytelling, transformed raw historical horror, mass murder, and pillage into a structured epic of betrayal, revenge, and a cursed treasure. The gold became a symbol for the kingdom itself, something magnificent desired by all, that ultimately brought about the destruction of everyone who touched it. The legend doesn't just recount a secret, it is the secret, a nation's collective memory, encrypted in myth, forever preserving the story of a people who were lost but refused to be forgotten. Now, let's shift our gaze from the blood-soaked feuds of Italy and the mythical treasures of the Rhine to a scene of unparalleled opulence, a spectacle so grand it was designed to blind all of Europe to the secret machinations happening just beneath its glittering surface. Imagine a valley in northern France, transformed in the summer of 1520 into a temporary city of silk and gold. This was the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a summit meeting between two of history's most charismatic and competitive monarchs, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France. For over 2 weeks, they engaged in what can only be described as the most expensive diplomatic theater the world had ever seen. They erected temporary palaces of timber and canvas, painted to look like stone and hung with enough velvet and cloth of gold, a fabric woven with silk and real gold threads, to give the event its legendary name. There were endless tournaments where the two kings, both athletes in their prime, jousted against each other, their lances crashing in a display of controlled rivalry. There were feasts with thousands of guests, fountains that ran with wine, and a masque featuring a fake mountain and a choir dressed as classical deities. The entire event was a breathtaking performance of wealth, power, and apparent friendship between two nations that had been at war for generations. But behind this facade of chivalric brotherhood and celebration, a far more serious and secret game was being played. The lavish public displays were merely the cover for intense, private negotiations held in a specially constructed pavilion, its walls thick with tapestries to prevent eavesdropping. The true purpose of this summit was not to celebrate peace, but to forge a secret military alliance. The real target of their discussions was not each other, but a common, towering rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles, who was also the King of Spain, ruled over a vast, sprawling empire that encircled France. Both Francis and Henry felt threatened by his overwhelming power. Francis wanted to break free from this Habsburg encirclement, while Henry, though married to Charles's aunt, Catherine of Aragon, was growing increasingly frustrated with the emperor's influence and saw an opportunity to tilt the balance of power in Europe. In those clandestine meetings, the two monarchs discussed a breathtakingly ambitious plan, a joint invasion of the Holy Roman Empire. They drew up the outlines of a pact, a promise to support each other militarily and politically against Charles. This was the realpolitik hidden beneath the silk and the feasting. The field of the cloth of gold was a giant smokescreen, a magnificent deception designed to dazzle observers and, most importantly, to conceal their true intentions from Charles's extensive network of spies. Every joust, every toast, every public display of amity was a move in a high-stakes chess game, each king trying to gain a psychological advantage over the other even as they negotiated their secret compact. Yet, in the end, the pact forged in that valley of gold was built on a foundation of mistrust and ultimately proved worthless. Both Henry and Francis were too proud, too ambitious, and too suspicious of each other to ever truly align. The promises made in the tapestry-lined pavilion were vague and non-binding, lacking the concrete commitments needed for a true military alliance. Just weeks after the last golden tapestry was taken down and the wine fountains ran dry, Henry VIII performed a stunning about-face. He held a second, far less glamorous summit with Charles V near Calais. There, without the pageantry but with far more serious intent, he reaffirmed his old alliance with the Habsburg Emperor, completely undermining the secret discussions he had just had with Francis. The field of the cloth of gold stands as one of history's greatest examples of diplomatic theater. Its secret was not a hidden marriage or a poisoned cup, but the immense gap between public performance and private intention. It demonstrated that in the world of Renaissance kings, grand gestures of friendship were often just the opening moves in a cynical game of power. The real lesson of all that gold and silk is that sometimes the most spectacular displays are created precisely to hide the fact that nothing of substance is actually there. A warning that when monarchs meet in a field of gold, you can be certain their real interests are being discussed somewhere in the shadows, far from the cheering crowds. But even as the legend of a sunken treasure demonstrates the power of myth to preserve a lost kingdom, another secret lay hidden not in a riverbed, but in plain sight on the towering monuments of Egypt, waiting centuries for its truth to be resurrected. Journey now to the banks of the Nile in the 15th century before the Common Era, to the zenith of Egypt's golden age. The pharaoh ruling over this era of unprecedented peace and prosperity was one of the most formidable and successful in all of Egyptian history, commissioning vast building projects, reopening lucrative trade routes, and securing the wealth and power of the empire. This pharaoh's name was Motker, and to all the world he was a king, but he was a she. This was Hatshepsut, the woman who dared to become pharaoh. Her path to power was born of crisis. Upon the death of her husband, Thutmose II, the throne passed to his infant son by a minor wife, Thutmose III. Hatshepsut, as the dead king's royal wife and daughter of the previous pharaoh, initially ruled as regent for the young boy, but within a few years she made a breathtaking and radical decision. She ceased being the power behind the throne and seized the throne itself. In a civilization where the pharaoh was not just a king but a living god, a manifestation of the masculine god Horus, this was a theological and political earthquake. To legitimize her rule, Hatshepsut masterfully crafted a new identity. She had herself depicted in official art and statuary not as a queen but as a male king, complete with the traditional false beard, the kilt, and the muscular physique of a warrior. She even invented a divine provenance, claiming the god Amun-Ra himself had visited her mother, thus ordaining her reign from before her birth. For over 2 decades, she ruled as a brilliant strategist and administrator. Her most famous achievement was dispatching a monumental trading expedition to the fabled land of Punt, which returned with shiploads of gold, ivory, exotic woods, and living frankincense trees, wealth that funded her ambitious building program. Her masterpiece was a magnificent terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a breathtaking structure cut into the cliffs of Thebes, its colonnaded halls telling the story of her divine birth and glorious reign. She built obelisks at Karnak Temple that were among the tallest ever erected, sheathed in electrum so they would shine like a second sun across the Nile. Her reign was a resounding success, a time of stability and artistic flourishing. Then she died, and the secret began. Sometime after her death, toward the end of the reign of her stepson Thutmose III, who had finally assumed sole power, a systematic campaign of destruction was launched. It was a targeted, methodical act of historical annihilation. Workmen were sent across Egypt with chisels and hammers to every monument Hatshepsut had built. Her name was meticulously chiseled out of the stone cartouches, the oval rings that enclosed a pharaoh's throne name. Her elegant statues were torn down, smashed, and buried in pits. The stunning reliefs at Deir el-Bahri depicting her divine birth and accomplishments were defaced. Her towering obelisks at Karnak were not destroyed. Instead, they were encased within a new stone wall, physically hiding them from view while preserving them for the god Amun, a clear sign that the act was not one of petty vandalism but of calculated political and theological policy. The motive behind this great erase has been debated for over a century. The traditional theory pointed to simple, bitter resentment. Thutmose III, a brilliant military leader known as the Napoleon of Egypt, had been forced to wait in the wings for over 20 years while his stepmother ruled. Perhaps this was his long-delayed revenge, a furious effort to expunge the woman who had usurped his throne from the historical record. But many modern Egyptologists see a more complex and strategic reason. Thutmose was securing the succession for his own son, Amenhotep II. By removing the precedent of a powerful female pharaoh, he was reasserting the Mot, the fundamental order of the universe, which for the Egyptians demanded male rule. He was ensuring that no future queen could ever use Hatshepsut's successful reign as a justification to seize power again. It was about stabilizing the dynasty and protecting the divine masculine order of kingship for all eternity. The act was devastatingly effective. For centuries, Hatshepsut's existence became a secret. Her name vanished from the king lists compiled by later pharaohs. When early Egyptologists in the 19th century began piecing together the chronology of the new kingdom, they found puzzling gaps and confusing references to a king that sometimes seemed to be referred to as a queen. It was like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle with crucial pieces deliberately removed. The mystery began to unravel when they discovered her magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahri and the pits nearby filled with the shattered remains of her statues. The most conclusive evidence came in the 20th century with the discovery of her tomb in the Valley of the Kings and the identification of a canopic jaw bearing her name. The woman who had been erased was finally found. Hatshepsut's story is the ultimate testament to the fact that history is written by the victors, but it is also proof that the truth has a stubborn way of re-emerging. Thutmose III's attempt to turn her into a secret ultimately failed. His very act of destruction preserved her statues in those hidden pits, safe from the elements and later looters. The wall he built around her obelisks protected their exquisite carved surfaces for millennia. In trying to erase her, he inadvertently became her greatest preserver. Her secret, once a weapon used against her memory, is now the very thing that makes her legacy so powerful and unforgettable. A profound lesson that even the most absolute power cannot silence a truth forever. After the grand public spectacles of the Field of the Cloth of Gold and the silent, stone-carved erasure of a female pharaoh, we now plunge into a very different kind of secret, one not of diplomacy or legacy, but of raw, violent ambition, orchestrated in the bedchamber and the barracks. Our scene shifts to the vast, wintry landscape of 18th century Russia, a nation simmering with discontent under a ruler who seemed to be doing everything in his power to sabotage his own throne. This is the story of how a secret love affair between an empress and a guardsman became the spark that ignited a revolution, toppling an emperor and birthing the legend of Catherine the Great. The emperor in question was Peter III, a man who could scarcely have been less suited to rule the vast Russian Empire. He was a devoted admirer of Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's sworn enemy in the ongoing 7 Years' War. To the utter horror of his generals and the Russian people, upon his ascension in 1762, Peter immediately withdrew Russian troops from Berlin, handing Frederick a miraculous victory and saving Prussia from certain defeat. He then forced the Russian army to adopt Prussian military uniforms and drills, a profound and insulting rejection of national pride. He publicly mocked Russian Orthodox traditions and spoke of replacing the church with a Lutheran one. In just 6 months, he had alienated the military, the clergy, and the nobility, making himself appear not just incompetent, but an outright traitor to the nation he was supposed to lead. Watching this catastrophic reign from the sidelines was his wife, a German princess who had wholly embraced her adopted homeland. Catherine was brilliant, ambitious, and politically savvy, everything her husband was not. For years, she had endured a miserable and humiliating marriage to a man who openly preferred his mistresses and showed her nothing but contempt. But Catherine was not idle. She spent those years cultivating her own power base, immersing herself in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and crucially, building connections within the most important power block in the empire, the Imperial Guard. And it was here that her life became intertwined with that of a man who would become the instrument of her destiny, Grigory Orlov. Orlov was everything Peter III was not. He was a dashing war hero, a celebrated artillery officer who had been wounded at the Battle of Zorndorf. More importantly, he and his 4 brothers were wildly popular officers within the elite Guards regiments. Their loyalty was not to the distant Prussophilic Tsar, but to the intelligent, respectful, and strikingly charismatic Catherine. Their relationship began as a passionate secret affair, but it swiftly evolved into a political partnership. In the hushed, confidential spaces of the palace, surrounded by a tight circle of co-conspirators that included Grigory's brothers, the plan was hatched. They would not wait for Peter to drive Russia off a cliff. They would remove him. The coup, when it came, was breathtakingly swift and efficient. In the early hours of June 28, 1762, one of the conspirators rushed to Catherine at the palace of Montplaisir, warning her that Peter had finally discovered their plot and was preparing to arrest her. There was no more time for secrecy. Dressed in the simple uniform of a Guards officer, her hair unpowdered, she was whisked away to the barracks of the Ismailovsky regiment. The Orlov brothers had already done their work. The soldiers, already seething with hatred for Peter, greeted her with thunderous cheers, swearing allegiance to her as their sole sovereign. From there, the snowball effect was unstoppable. She was escorted to the Kazan Cathedral, where the clergy anointed her as the rightful ruler, and then to the Winter Palace, where the rest of the Guards regiments and the governing Senate fell in line without a single shot being fired. Meanwhile, Peter III, caught completely by surprise and utterly isolated at his country palace at Oranienbaum, panicked. He had no loyal troops to call upon and no plan. He abdicated the throne without a fight, effectively signing his own death warrant. He was arrested and taken to a remote estate at Ropsha, placed under the guard of Alexei Orlov, Grigory's formidable and ruthless brother. The official story given to the public was one of national necessity, that Catherine had been forced to act to save Russia from a traitorous and mentally unstable monarch. It was a narrative of salvation, not seizure. But just 1 week later, the new empress's carefully constructed story was shaken by a new and far more permanent secret. Tsar Peter was dead. The official announcement stated he had died from a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic, a diagnosis so absurd it was an insult to everyone's intelligence. The truth, detailed in a controversial and possibly forged letter from Alexei Orlov to Catherine, described a violent drunken brawl among his captors that ended with the deposed emperor being strangled. Whether Catherine explicitly ordered the murder or simply created the conditions where it was all but inevitable remains one of history's great unanswered questions. What is certain is that Peter's survival would have been a perpetual threat to her reign, a lightning rod for every disgruntled noble and foreign power that wished her ill. His death, however it happened, solved that problem permanently. Catherine understood the power of perception. She never spoke of Peter again. She never punished his killers. She allowed the official, ridiculous medical explanation to stand, focusing instead on crafting her own legacy as the enlightened savior of Russia. The secret murder at Ropsha became the unspoken, bloody foundation upon which she built one of the most transformative reigns in Russian history. For 34 years, she expanded the empire, patronized the arts and sciences, and corresponded with Voltaire, all while the ghost of her husband lingered in the background. Her story is the ultimate proof that the transfer of absolute power is rarely a clean, legal affair. More often, it is a brutal secret hidden behind a story the people desperately want to believe. Catherine's genius was not just in orchestrating the coup, but in masterfully ensuring that the violent secret that made it possible would be forever overshadowed by the glorious myth she created in its place. But just as one empress rose to power through a military coup, a very different kind of upheaval would grip France over a century later, one that began not in a palace but in a trash can. In 1894, a simple piece of torn paper, fished out of a wastebasket at the German embassy in Paris, set in motion a scandal that would become the defining battle for the soul of modern France. The document, which would become infamous as the Bordereau, was a list of French military secrets being offered to the Germans. The hunt for a traitor was on, and the army's high command quickly settled on a suspect, Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He was the perfect culprit, quiet, reserved, and crucially, he was Jewish. In an army and a society still steeped in casual, institutional anti-Semitism, this was evidence enough for many. After a sham secret trial based on forged documents and perjured testimony, Dreyfus was convicted of treason, publicly stripped of his rank in a humiliating ceremony where the crowd screamed, "Death to the Jew," and shipped off to a lifetime of brutal solitary confinement on Devil's Island. The case was officially closed. The army had its traitor, its honor was seemingly intact, and the public was satisfied. But that was only the surface story, the one presented to the world. The real explosive secret lay in what happened next. The head of military intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Piquart, a man who had initially believed in Dreyfus's guilt, continued his investigation. And what he discovered should have set Dreyfus free. Piquart found irrefutable evidence that the real spy was a dashing, dissolute infantry officer named Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. More shockingly, he discovered that his own superiors in the army's high command knew it. They had known almost from the beginning. When Piquart presented his findings, he was not thanked. He was silenced, threatened, and eventually transferred to a remote post in Tunisia to get him out of the way. The secret was no longer about who committed the crime. It was about the conspiracy at the highest levels of the French army to conceal the truth. Why would the army's elite, men sworn to defend the nation, engage in such a breathtaking cover-up? The answer lies not in the guilt of one man, but in the perceived sanctity of an entire institution. To the generals, the army was more than just a fighting force. It was the last bastion of traditional pre-revolutionary France. It represented order, hierarchy, and national pride, everything they believed the shaky, politically messy Third Republic was not. To admit that they had convicted an innocent man, and a Jewish one at that, while letting the real aristocratic traitor go free, would have been a catastrophic blow to the army's prestige and authority. In their view, protecting the institution's infallible image was more important than the life of one individual. The cover-up was an act of patriotic preservation in their eyes, a necessary lie to uphold a greater truth, the myth of the army's unassailable honor. This is where the scandal connects directly to our theme of royal secrets. A century after the guillotine had fallen on the last king of France, the Dreyfus affair ripped the lid off a division that had never truly healed. French society split violently into two camps, the Dreyfusards who fought for justice and truth, and the anti-Dreyfusards who stood for the authority of the army and the state. And the heart of the anti-Dreyfusard movement was beating with a distinctly royalist pulse. For the monarchists, the Catholic aristocracy, and the staunch nationalists, the army was their last great hope. It was the one institution that still embodied the old values of the ancient regime: discipline, tradition, and a clear social order untouched by republican ideals of liberty and equality. They saw the attack on the army's judgment in the Dreyfus case as nothing less than an attack on France itself, an assault led by intellectuals, Jews, and Protestants, all forces they associated with the modern, decadent republic they despised. The secret at the heart of the Dreyfus affair was therefore a dual one. On one level, it was the criminal conspiracy to imprison an innocent man, but on a far deeper, more profound level, it was the secret that the French Revolution had not succeeded in erasing the old world. The ghost of the monarchy and its rigid social order still walked the halls of power, particularly within the army officer corps. The affair was a brutal public referendum on what kind of nation France would be: a modern republic based on the rights of the individual and the primacy of justice, or a traditionalist state where the authority of institutions like the army and the church trumped all else. It took over a decade, the passionate activism of figures like Émile Zola with his famous headline, J'accuse, and the relentless work of Dreyfus's family before the truth finally prevailed and he was exonerated. But the fissures it revealed ran deep. The Dreyfus affair demonstrated with shocking clarity that the battles of the 18th century were still being fought in the 19th, and that the most dangerous secrets are not always about what was done, but about who we still are long after the crowns have been melted down and the palaces turned into museums. While the Dreyfus affair exposed the lingering ghosts of the old regime in France's military, a far more direct and damning royal secret had already sealed that same monarchy's fate a century earlier. It centers on the most famous and most infamous queen in French history, Marie Antoinette. To the starving masses of Paris, she was l'Autrichienne, a cruel pun meaning both the Austrian woman and the Austrian bitch. This was more than just an insult. It was an accusation that she carried a secret loyalty to her Habsburg family in Vienna, a loyalty that trumped her duty to France. And as the revolution began to boil over, this perception curdled into a terrifying certainty that the queen was the head of a clandestine Austrian committee, a fifth column operating within the very heart of the palace of Versailles, scheming to sabotage the new France from within. The truth of these allegations is a complex tapestry woven with threads of genuine indiscretion, desperate strategy, and outright revolutionary fabrication. There is no doubt that Marie Antoinette maintained a secret correspondence network. Her most trusted confidant was the handsome Swedish nobleman Count Axel von Fersen, a man widely believed to be the love of her life. Their letters, often written in invisible ink or sent via a web of trusted couriers to avoid interception, were filled with personal affection and intense political plotting. More crucially, she was in regular, clandestine communication with her brother, Emperor Leopold II of Austria. To the Queen, this was not treason, it was realpolitik. She saw herself as the only sane person in a crumbling government, trying to guide her weak-willed husband, King Louis XVI, and broker a stable outcome between the revolutionary government and the exiled aristocracy. But in her desperation, she crossed a line that would forever damn her. She began passing sensitive state secrets to Vienna. She provided Leopold with detailed accounts of the debates within the French king's private council, revealing the divisions among his ministers and the king's own indecisive nature. Most catastrophically of all, she is believed to have divulged French military plans. As tensions escalated toward war between revolutionary France and the monarchical powers of Austria and Prussia, the Queen reportedly sent vital intelligence on French army deployments, strategies, and weaknesses to her brother. Her motive was likely a twisted form of patriotism. She believed a short, sharp military defeat for the revolutionary forces would break their power and allow for a restoration of the monarchy's authority. But to the French people, it was the ultimate betrayal. This flow of information became a powerful torrent of propaganda in the hands of radical journalists like Jean-Paul Marat and Camille Desmoulins. They did not need concrete proof, the mere suggestion was enough. In his wildly popular newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, Marat ceaselessly hammered the image of the Queen as a foreign spy, a modern-day Medusa whose whispers were poisoning the king and selling out the nation. Pamphlets and caricatures depicted her in orgiastic scenes with her courtiers, counting French gold that she would ship to Austria, or literally holding the strings of a puppet like Louis XVI. The king was no longer seen as a well-intentioned bungler. He was painted as a hapless cuckold, dominated by his Austrian wife and entirely under the control of foreign powers. The secret diplomacy of the Queen, however well-intentioned she may have believed it to be, provided the revolutionaries with the perfect villain. She became the embodiment of everything wrong with the old regime, its decadence, its foreign influence, its contempt for the French people. This manufactured narrative reached its bloody climax after the royal family's failed attempt to flee Paris in June 1791, the disastrous flight to Versailles. It was Fersen who had organized the entire escape plan, using his foreign diplomatic status to procure a heavy custom-built carriage and plot the route. When the plan failed and the royal family was captured and dragged back to Paris, it was seen as incontrovertible proof of the Austrian committee at work. The king and queen were now officially traitors in the eyes of the people. The subsequent discovery of the Armoire de Fer, an iron strongbox hidden in the Tuileries palace containing Louis's secret correspondence with foreign powers, only sealed their fate. The perception of the Queen's secret treason, meticulously cultivated by her enemies, had become an unshakable truth. It was this potent mix of fact and fiction that fueled the public rage, leading her to the guillotine on October 16, 1793. Her death was not just the execution of a queen, it was the elimination of a perceived foreign agent, the final severing of the monarchy's treacherous ties to outside powers. In the end, the secret of her correspondence was so powerful that it didn't matter if every accusation was entirely true. The belief itself was enough to shake a kingdom to dust. While Europe's monarchies were being torn apart by the secrets of their rulers, a very different kind of concealment was taking shape across the Atlantic, one that would define the leadership of the free world during its darkest hours. The year is 1932, and the United States is mired in the bleakest depths of the Great Depression. Banks are failing, millions are unemployed, and a sense of paralyzing fear grips the nation. In this moment of profound crisis, the country turns to a new leader, a man whose confident smile and uplifting voice promise action, energy, and unshakable strength. Franklin Delano Roosevelt projects an image of vigorous, dynamic health, a symbol of national recovery. But this image was a carefully constructed illusion, a secret so well kept that most Americans living through his historic 12-year presidency never knew the full truth. Their indomitable president was a paraplegic, unable to stand or walk on his own. FDR's secret began in 1921, when a vibrant 39-year-old man was suddenly struck down by a severe illness, then diagnosed as polio, though modern analysis suggests it may have been Guillain-Barré syndrome. The disease left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. For a man of his ambition and social standing, it was a catastrophic personal blow. Yet, with an iron will that would later define his presidency, Roosevelt refused to be defined by his disability. He painstakingly rebuilt his upper body strength and learned to move with heavy, painful steel leg braces that locked at the knee. But he could only walk for short, agonizing public performances, relying on a strong arm to lean on and the gripping hand of one of his sons to remain upright. For day-to-day mobility, he was entirely dependent on a wheelchair, understanding that the perception of physical weakness could be a political death sentence, especially in an era that deeply stigmatized disability. Roosevelt and his inner circle engineered one of the most successful conspiracies of silence in American history. The White House, in collusion with a largely compliant press corps, enacted an unwritten rule. The president's paralysis was never to be photographed, filmed, or mentioned in news reports. The Secret Service played a crucial role, often physically jostling photographers or even seizing their cameras if they attempted to capture a shot of the president in a vulnerable moment. FDR's car was always driven directly up to event entrances so he could be lifted out and appear to be walking. Ramps were built and then immediately dismantled to avoid drawing attention. At speeches, the lectern was bolted to the floor so he could use it for support, his powerful torso and gesturing arms creating the impression of a man in complete command of his body and the nation's destiny. This elaborate choreography was about more than just vanity or personal pride. It was a calculated strategy of statecraft. During the immense trials of the Depression and the Second World War, Roosevelt and his advisors believed the nation needed a symbol of robust, uncompromising strength. A visibly disabled leader, they feared, might be perceived by both the American public and by foreign adversaries like Hitler and Mussolini as weak, indecisive, or incapable of bearing the immense burden of command. The secret was maintained to project an aura of confidence and control, to be the strong father figure a terrified country desperately needed. In many ways, it worked brilliantly. His fireside chats, his confident grin, and his commanding presence were a tonic to a weary nation. Yet, this monumental deception raises profound and enduring ethical questions that we still grapple with today. Where is the line between protecting a leader's image and the public's right to know the true physical condition of the person who holds the nuclear codes? Was this a necessary act of leadership during a time of unprecedented crisis, or a paternalistic deceit that underestimated the American people? The secret of FDR's health forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the machinery of power often prioritizes perception over unvarnished truth, crafting a palatable narrative to maintain stability and confidence. Roosevelt's legacy is forever intertwined with this paradox. The man who championed the phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," ultimately governed from a place of having to hide his own greatest vulnerability, proving that even in a modern democracy, the power of a monarchical image could be just as crucial as it was in the courts of Europe. But even as leaders like Roosevelt concealed personal vulnerabilities to project strength, the history of nations is scarred by moments where the most powerful simply drew lines on a map, dividing the world itself in secret pacts made for their own gain. After Columbus's monumental voyage in 1492, a frantic territorial dispute erupted between Europe's two great naval superpowers. Both Spain and Portugal, armed with papal bulls and a fierce sense of divine right, laid claim to the vast, unknown lands across the Atlantic. The threat of war between these Catholic giants loomed large, a conflict the Pope himself was desperate to avoid. And so, in the Spanish town of Tordesillas in 1494, diplomats from both kingdoms met behind closed doors to broker one of the most audacious secrets in history, a deal to literally divide the entire world between them. The agent of this incredible division was Pope Alexander VI, the same Borgia Pope whose family's exploits we explored earlier. He issued a decree drawing a north-south line of demarcation 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the west of this arbitrary meridian would belong to Spain. Everything to the east would be the exclusive domain of Portugal. But the Portuguese, savvy negotiators with a better grasp of geography, pushed for more. In the secret talks at Tordesillas, they managed to move the line further west to 370 leagues, a change that would have momentous, unintended consequences. This revised treaty was then ratified by both crowns, a secret pact blessed by the Vatican that essentially granted them a global duopoly on exploration, conquest, and trade. The rest of Europe, not to mention the millions of people already living in these territories, were not consulted. Their futures were being decided in a closed room in Castile by men who had no idea what they were actually dividing. The immediate effect was to prevent war between Spain and Portugal, but the long-term consequences were staggering, etching a cultural and linguistic divide onto two continents that persists to this day. Portugal, granted the Eastern Sphere, found its path to India around the Cape of Good Hope secure from Spanish competition, but the true jackpot came from that negotiated shift in the line. When the Portuguese explorer Pedro Alves Cabral made landfall in the year 1500, he found himself on a coast that, according to the secret treaty, fell well within Portugal's half of the world. This land would become Brazil, the only Portuguese-speaking nation in the Americas, a colossal territory whose very existence is a direct result of that last-minute bargaining in Tordesillas. Meanwhile, Spain claimed the lion's share of the Americas from California to Patagonia, implanting its language, its religion, and its colonial systems across millions of square miles. The arrogance of this secret agreement is breathtaking. It treated the globe like a Chinese letter to be sliced up between two greedy children, with no regard for the ancient kingdoms, complex cultures, and sovereign nations that already existed there. The treaty's line cut through the eastern bulge of South America, but for the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, the Inca in the Andes, or the Tupinambá of the coast, this paper decree from a distant pope was meaningless until it was enforced by the sword, the gun, and the disease-ridden blanket. The Treaty of Tordesillas is the ultimate expression of royal privilege, the belief that divine right and naval power granted two European monarchs the authority to parcel out the destiny of the entire planet in a secret deal. It is a stark reminder that the map of our modern world, the languages we speak, and the very history of the Americas were shaped not just by exploration and conquest, but by the hidden, arrogant strokes of a pen wielded in a secluded Spanish chamber. Yet, even as the guillotine's blade ended the story of Marie Antoinette, a new and even more heartbreaking royal secret was just beginning, one that would haunt France for the next 2 centuries. This is the tragic tale of Louis Charles, the young son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who, at the tender age of 7, was officially recognized by the exiled royalists as King Louis XVII of France. His story begins in the shadow of his parents' execution, when he and his older sister were imprisoned in the Temple, a grim medieval fortress in the heart of Paris. For a revolution that had sworn to overthrow tyranny, the treatment of this child became its darkest, most shameful chapter. He was torn from his mother's arms and placed under the guard of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, a man appointed by the radical government to re-educate the boy, to strip him of his royal identity and force him to testify against his own mother during her trial. The psychological torture was unimaginable. He was plied with alcohol, taught to sing crude revolutionary songs, and coerced into signing a document accusing his mother of incest. After Simon and his wife left their post, the boy's situation deteriorated from neglect into something far more horrific. He was left in a darkened, sealed room, a virtual oubliette, without any change of clothes or proper human contact. His food was passed through a grate, and he was left to languish in his own filth for months on end. When he finally died on June 8, 1795, at just 10 years old, the official cause was given as tuberculosis, but it was really death by deliberate neglect, a slow-motion execution carried out in silence. The revolutionaries, wanting to be done with the entire Bourbon line, performed a quick autopsy and buried the child in a common grave, but that should have been the end of it. Instead, a secret was born. Almost immediately, whispers began to circulate through the slums of Paris and the courts of Europe. The story went that the dead boy was not the true Dauphin at all, but a substitute, a deaf-mute or a sickly peasant child switched for the real prince, who had been smuggled out of the temple in a laundry basket. The revolutionary government itself fueled these rumors by their own actions. They had failed to properly exhibit the body to the public, and the grave was so poorly marked that it was immediately lost. This created a vacuum of doubt, and into that vacuum rushed a hope too powerful to extinguish, the hope that a king had survived. For decades, this secret hope manifested in the most bizarre way imaginable, through a parade of impostors. Over 100 men across Europe and even America would step forward, each claiming to be the lost king of France. The most compelling of these was a German clockmaker named Karl Wilhelm Naundorff. He arrived in Paris in the 1830s with an uncanny knowledge of life at the Versailles court, knowing intimate details about the royal family's private rooms and routines that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. He even managed to win a civil court case to legally change his name to Louis de Bourbon. While the French courts never recognized his claim, he gained a significant following, and his descendants continue to press his case to this day. Other claimants ranged from a missionary in the American frontier to an elderly man in the Seychelles Islands, each with their own elaborate story of escape and concealment. This was far more than just a curiosity. The mystery of the lost Dauphin became the most potent political symbol for the monarchist movement in France. Throughout the 19th century, as the country lurched between republic, empire, and restored monarchy, the figure of the innocent boy king languishing in prison was a powerful weapon. For royalists, he was a martyr whose return could miraculously heal the nation's deep divisions and restore the divine line of kings. The very ambiguity of his fate was useful. A dead prince was a tragedy, but a missing prince was a possibility, a blank slate upon which every faction could project its own dreams of a triumphant return. The secret was kept alive not by evidence but by a deep, collective yearning for a different, less traumatic ending to the revolution's bloody story. The truth, however, is often colder than legend. In a macabre twist, a heart had been secretly removed during the autopsy of the boy in the temple. This organ, preserved in alcohol, became a sacred relic, passed down through generations of royalists and eventually housed in the royal crypt at St. Denis Basilica. For 2 centuries, its authenticity was debated. Then, in the year 2000, modern science was finally called upon to solve this ancient mystery. Geneticists performed DNA testing on the heart, comparing it to locks of hair from Marie Antoinette and other maternal relatives. The results were definitive. The DNA was a perfect match. The heart, and therefore the boy who died in that squalid prison room, was unquestionably Louis XVII. The lost Dauphin was never lost. He had been there all along, a victim of a brutal regime that had no place for a child, no matter what his name was. The secret that had fueled monarchist dreams for over 200 years was finally, and tragically, laid to rest. From the grim fate of a lost dauphin, we turn to a story of dazzling illusion, a royal tour that became the ultimate symbol of political theater. It begins with the indomitable Catherine the Great, whose ambition to modernize and westernize Russia was as vast as her empire. In 1787, she planned a monumental journey, a 6-month grand tour of the empire's southern territories, recently wrested from the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a strategic spectacle. Aboard a luxurious flotilla of 7 lavish galleys, she sailed down the Dnieper River, accompanied by a court of nobles, foreign ambassadors, and the Austrian Emperor Joseph II himself. The goal was to showcase Russia's newfound power, prosperity, and civilization in these wild, newly conquered lands, to prove to a skeptical Europe that Russia was no longer a backward northern beast, but a refined and potent empire. The man tasked with orchestrating this triumph was Catherine's former lover, closest advisor, and the governor of these southern provinces, Prince Grigory Potemkin. He was a man of immense energy and vision, but he was also a master of grand gestures and relentless self-promotion. The territories under his control, however, were largely undeveloped and sparsely populated, a far cry from the prosperous paradise Catherine needed to display. Faced with this immense pressure and an impossible deadline, Potemkin is alleged to have devised one of history's most audacious deceptions. As the imperial flotilla glided down the river, its distinguished passengers were treated to a mesmerizing panorama. Along the banks, they saw neat, freshly painted villages bustling with activity. Well-dressed, happy-looking peasants waved cheerfully from prosperous-looking farms and thriving town squares. Herds of cattle grazed in lush pastures, and the entire landscape projected an image of idyllic, orderly abundance. The foreign dignitaries were reportedly amazed at the rapid development Potemkin had achieved in such a short time. The secret, as the story goes, was that this entire scene was a magnificent fraud. Those picturesque villages were nothing more than elaborate stage sets, false fronts propped up just deep enough to be convincing from the river. The happy, prosperous peasants were actually the same group of serfs, hurriedly shuttled down river under cover of darkness to repopulate the next fake village before the flotilla arrived. The fat herds of cattle were also driven through the night to reappear further along the route, creating the illusion of widespread livestock. Even the rocks along the shore were reportedly painted to look more picturesque. It was a colossal, moving panorama of pure fiction, designed to convince the Empress and her guests that Potemkin's administration was a miraculous success, thereby securing his continued favor and funding. But how true is this legendary tale? Historians have fiercely debated the extent of Potemkin's deception for centuries. The original accounts came from Potemkin's political enemies, particularly a disgruntled Saxon diplomat who published the allegations after the tour, and they were eagerly seized upon by a Europe that delighted in portraying Russia as a land of barbaric pretense. It's highly unlikely that Potemkin could have built hundreds of miles of entirely fake settlements. The logistics would have been nearly impossible. A more nuanced truth is probably a mixture of reality and embellishment. Potemkin was a genuinely effective administrator who did build new towns and encourage settlement in the region. His real crime was likely one of extreme stage management. He almost certainly cleaned up existing villages, forced impoverished serfs to wear their best clothes and pretend to be happy, and hid any signs of poverty or failure behind temporary screens of painted canvas and forced cheer. The deception was not in building villages from nothing, but in creating a wildly exaggerated, sanitized, and utterly false narrative of universal prosperity. Regardless of its precise historical accuracy, the story's power was undeniable. The term Potemkin village instantly entered the global lexicon as the perfect description for any literally or figuratively false front, erected at great cost to hide an ugly truth. It is the ultimate symbol of the lengths to which those in power will go to manufacture consent and awe, to substitute perception for reality. This secret shakes our faith not just in a single prince or empress, but in leadership itself. It reveals a chilling truth that the grand displays of state power we are shown are often just carefully designed performances, and that the prosperity we are meant to see might just be a set piece, waiting to be dismantled as soon as the royal barge has sailed around the bend. While the story of Potemkin's villages reveals a physical illusion designed to project power, our next secret strikes at the very heart of what a nation believes itself to be. We travel now to the turbulent world of 17th century England, a nation still deeply scarred by civil war and regicide, where the newly restored monarchy was walking a fragile tightrope. The king was Charles II, a man known for his charm and political cunning, but his brother and heir, James, Duke of York, was a far different and more troubling figure. For years, a dangerous rumor had been swirling through the coffee houses and courtly drawing rooms of London, a rumor that James had secretly converted to Catholicism. This wasn't just a matter of personal conscience. In post-Reformation England, it was a political crime of the highest order. The nation defined itself in opposition to the popish powers of France and Spain. Catholicism was associated with absolute monarchy, foreign influence, and the dreaded Spanish Inquisition. The very idea that the man next in line for the throne might be a secret papist sent shivers through the Protestant establishment. For a time, James maintained the public facade. He attended Anglican services, but his absence from communion was a telltale sign for those who knew what to look for. The secret finally burst into the open in the early 1670s, following a parliamentary attempt to force a religious test on all public officials. James refused to take the Anglican sacrament and was forced to resign his post as Lord High Admiral. The secret was out. The heir to the throne was an avowed Catholic. The situation exploded into a full-blown political crisis known as the Exclusion Crisis. A faction in Parliament, led by the Earl of Shaftesbury, tried desperately to pass a law excluding James from the succession altogether. Pamphlets and sermons whipped the public into a frenzy of anti-Catholic hysteria, fueled by the completely fabricated but widely believed Popish plot, a tale of a Jesuit conspiracy to assassinate the king. Charles II managed to shield his brother, dissolving Parliament and ruling without it to preserve the principle of hereditary succession, but the genie was out of the bottle. The English people now knew they had a Catholic heir, and the knowledge filled them with a deep and abiding dread. When James finally ascended the throne as James II in 1685, that dread quickly turned into outright alarm. At first, he promised to defend the Church of England, but his actions spoke a very different language. He began a systematic campaign to undermine the laws that guaranteed Protestant supremacy, using his royal prerogative to bypass a hostile parliament. He issued declarations of indulgence that suspended penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike. While framed as an act of religious tolerance, his true aim was transparent: to allow Catholics to hold positions of power. He started appointing Catholics to key posts in the army, the universities, and even his Privy Council. He surrounded himself with Jesuit advisors and received a papal envoy at court, an act that to many Englishmen was akin to welcoming the enemy into the gates. Each of these moves was a deliberate provocation, a direct challenge to the established constitutional order, but the final, terrifying straw came in the summer of 1688. The king's second wife, the Italian Catholic Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. The nation was stunned. Until that moment, the public's fear had been tempered by a single, comforting fact. James's heirs were his two adult Protestant daughters from his first marriage, Mary and Anne. They had been raised as Anglicans, and their succession promised a swift return to a Protestant monarchy. The new baby boy changed everything. He would be raised as a Catholic, the first in an unbroken line of Catholic Stuart kings. The nightmare of a permanent Popish dynasty was now a terrifying reality. The birth itself was immediately shrouded in controversy. Whig propagandists seized on the opportunity, spreading the infamous rumor that the child was not truly the Queen's. They claimed a baby had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan, a supposititious child meant to usurp the Protestant heirs. There was no truth to it, but the story spread like wildfire because the public was desperate to believe it. It was easier to accept a bizarre conspiracy than to accept the bleak future a Catholic heir represented. This combination of a king's open defiance of the law and the birth of a Catholic prince forced the nation to make an impossible choice: loyalty to their anointed king or loyalty to their Protestant faith and the laws of the land. The answer came from a group of 7 influential noblemen who sent a secret invitation to James's own son-in-law, the Protestant Dutch stadtholder William of Orange. They urged William to invade England and rescue its liberties and its religion. William, who saw a strategic opportunity to bring England into his war against the Catholic Louis XIV of France, agreed. He landed with a massive army at Torbay in November 1688. What happened next was not a war but a collapse. James's support evaporated. His own daughter, Anne, deserted him. His military commanders, including the famed John Churchill, defected to William's side. The king's nerve broke and he fled to France, throwing the great seal of the realm into the River Thames in a final, symbolic act of abdication. Parliament declared that by fleeing, James had effectively abdicated and offered the throne jointly to William and Mary. This was the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup that fundamentally reshaped the British Constitution, establishing the principle that the monarchy derived its power from Parliament, not from God. James II's secret faith, once a private matter, had become a public catastrophe that cost him his crown. His story is a powerful lesson in the limits of royal power. It proved that a monarch's most personal beliefs are never truly private, they are matters of state. In a nation where identity was so deeply tied to religion, a Catholic king was not just a ruler the people disliked. He was a living contradiction of the state's very essence, a secret that the nation simply could not abide. But perhaps no figure in history better embodies the collision of absolute power and absolute depravity than the 5th Emperor of Rome. If the previous secrets were hidden in iron masks or whispered in palace corridors, the scandals of Nero were monstrous spectacles played out on the grandest stage imaginable. His reign represents a terrifying plunge into a world where the most shocking acts were not secrets to be concealed, but open celebrations of a tyrant's whim. So extreme they shook the very pillars of the Roman world and brought its greatest dynasty crashing down in flames. Our story begins not in darkness but in an inferno. In the sweltering July heat of 64 AD, a fire broke out in the shops around Rome's Circus Maximus. Fanned by strong winds, the flames quickly became an unstoppable beast, raging for 6 days and 7 nights through the city's narrow, winding streets and densely packed apartment blocks. When the smoke finally cleared, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were smoldering ruins. Thousands were dead and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. In the midst of this civilization-shattering catastrophe, a story began to circulate, a secret suspicion that would forever brand the emperor's name with infamy. It was said that Nero had been miles away at his seaside villa in Antium when the fire started, but that upon hearing the news he rushed back to Rome. And what did he do? He ascended to the roof of his palace, donned a stage costume, and sang a song about the fall of Troy while accompanying himself on the lyre, watching the ancient city burn as if it were a theatrical backdrop for his private performance. This image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is one of history's most enduring symbols of a leader's callous indifference. The story is almost certainly a later embellishment. The fiddle hadn't been invented yet, and the accounts were written by his political enemies years after his death. But the rumor took root because it fit a terrifying pattern of behavior. The greater secret, the one that truly terrified the Roman people, was the whispered allegation that Nero didn't just watch the fire, he started it. The ancient historians Tacitus and Suetonius, while cautiously skeptical, both report the persistent belief that Nero's own agents were seen torching buildings to ensure the fire spread. His motive, according to the rumor, was to clear prime real estate in the heart of the city for his most audacious and narcissistic project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This was not merely a palace, it was a sprawling, opulent fantasyland that sprawled across hundreds of acres. It featured a 120-foot-tall statue of himself, the Colossus Neronis, lavish vineyards and game parks, and a banqueting hall with a revolving ivory ceiling that showered flowers and perfume on guests below. Most insultingly to the traditional Roman aristocracy, it featured an artificial lake where the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, would later be built. To the people shivering in temporary shelters, the idea that their emperor had obliterated their homes to build a pleasure garden for himself was a psychological wound that would never heal. Whether he actually ordered the fire or not became almost irrelevant. The public believed he was capable of it, and that belief was a political fact more powerful than any truth. To divert blame from himself, Nero found the perfect scapegoat, a small, obscure religious sect known as Christians. He unleashed a wave of horrific persecutions against them, having them torn apart by dogs, crucified, and burned alive as human torches to light his garden parties. This act of brutal deflection was itself a dark, open secret, a very public atrocity designed to bury one rumor by creating a spectacle of even greater cruelty. It cemented his image not as a responsible leader, but as a monster who would sacrifice anyone to protect his own reputation and feed his decadent desires. This descent into monstrosity had a clear starting point, one that revealed the ultimate price of crossing the woman who made him emperor. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a political force of nature. She was the sister of the infamous Emperor Caligula, the wife of Emperor Claudius, and the mother of Nero. She schemed, manipulated, and allegedly even poisoned her way through the imperial court to secure the throne for her young son. For the first years of his reign, she was the true power behind the throne, even having herself included on official coins facing her son, an unprecedented honor for a woman. But as Nero grew older and fell under the influence of new advisors like the philosopher Seneca and the ruthless prefect Tigellinus, he began to chafe under her domineering control. Agrippina represented the old guard, and she openly disapproved of his affair with the beautiful Poppaea Sabina, who was whispering that Nero would never be truly free until his mother was gone. What followed was a series of failed assassination attempts so bizarre they seem lifted from a satire. First, Nero tried to poison her, but the story goes that she had built up an immunity by taking small doses of poison throughout her life. Next, he had a collapsible ceiling installed over her bed, but the mechanism failed and the plot was discovered. Finally, he devised a scheme involving a specially engineered boat that was meant to break apart and sink while she was sailing on the Bay of Naples. The boat did indeed collapse, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, survived and made it to shore. When Nero received word that the plot had failed and his mother was alive and well and knew everything, he panicked. He immediately dispatched a squad of naval marines to finish the job. They found her at her villa and clubbed her to death. The official story was that she had been executed for plotting against the emperor's life, but the open secret of his matricide hung over Rome like a pall. Nero was said to have later inspected her corpse, coldly remarking on her beauty. He had crossed the ultimate human and Roman taboo, proving that there was no line he would not cross to secure his own absolute, unfettered power. Freed from his mother's restraint, Nero's behavior became increasingly unmoored from reality and Roman tradition. His most baffling secret, one he seemed desperate to share with the world, was his burning desire to be not just an emperor but a celebrity artist. In a culture where the aristocracy viewed acting and public performance as disgraceful professions fit only for slaves and social outcasts, Nero insisted on performing on stage. He would sing, play the lyre, and even act in tragedies, forcing the Roman elite to attend his interminable recitals. To ensure applause, he would fill the theaters with his own soldiers, who were under orders to cheer ecstatically. He even embarked on a concert tour of Greece, competing in various games and festivals. Unsurprisingly, he won every single contest he entered, as the judges were too terrified to award the victory to anyone else. These performances were not a private indulgence, they were a very public abdication of his duty. The emperor was supposed to be the embodiment of Roman virtue, dignified, martial, and austere. Nero presented himself as a Greek-loving artiste, a devotee of a culture Romans viewed as decadent and weak. His secret wasn't that he performed, it was that he genuinely seemed to believe he was a divine artist, a genius whose cultural achievements outweighed his political responsibilities. This profound disconnect from the expectations of his office revealed a man living in a dangerous fantasy, one where the applause of a captive audience was more important than the respect of his subjects or the stability of the empire. The cumulative weight of these secrets and scandals, the suspected arson, the public murder of his mother, the disgraceful stage performances, and the brutal persecution of innocents finally became too much for the Roman world to bear. The open secret was now that the emperor was a madman. Revolts broke out across the provinces. The Senate, emboldened by his loss of support from the army and the people, finally declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by everyone, Nero fled Rome. Hiding in a villa outside the city, he heard the horses of the soldiers coming to arrest him and drag him to a bloody public execution. With the help of a loyal secretary, he plunged a dagger into his own throat, his final words reportedly a lament for the world losing such a great artist. His death marked the violent end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the founding family of the Roman Empire. Nero's reign stands as an eternal warning of what happens when power is stripped of all restraint, when the most horrific acts are no longer secrets but a tyrant's public performance, and when the whims of one man are so monstrous that they can shake an entire civilization to its very core. And so we see it, the stunning thread that connects them all, from a tsar's murdered children to a president's hidden wheelchair, from a marriage certificate that defied a kingdom to a poisoned cup that shattered an empire. These were not mere scandals or gossip, they were seismic events disguised as whispers. A single secret held in the right hands at the wrong time possessed a power greater than any army. It could topple a government that had stood for centuries, rewrite a nation's spiritual identity, or plunge a continent into a war that would claim millions of lives. The most dangerous weapon in any royal arsenal was never the cannon or the sword. It was the truth they fought so desperately to suppress. What is it about these hidden stories that captivates us so completely, even centuries later? Perhaps it's the undeniable proof that history is not a dry procession of dates and treaties, but a deeply human drama. Behind every crown was a person frightened, ambitious, fallible, and desperate. They loved, they hated, they made terrible choices, and they clung to power with every fiber of their being. Their secrets are the ultimate breach in the palace walls, a chance for us to see the incredible fragility behind the magnificent facade of absolute power. They remind us that the official story is often just the cover page, and that the real narrative, the messy, complicated, and shocking truth, is waiting patiently in the shadows to be discovered. These mysteries connect us across time because they speak to a universal longing, the desire to know what really happened. It's the same impulse that makes us lean in when a secret is about to be told. We are drawn to the gap between the polished myth and the messy reality, to the moment when a human weakness or a reckless passion changes the destiny of nations. Each of these 25 secrets is a keyhole, offering us a stolen glance into the inner sanctums of power, and in doing so, they give us a far richer, more thrilling, and more true understanding of our own world, which was built upon their consequences. Now we turn the question over to you, because history is a conversation that never truly ends. Looking back through these corridors of power, which of these kingdom-shaking secrets surprised you the most? Was it the sheer audacity of the field of the cloth of gold's deception, the tragic fate of the lost dauphin, or the shocking personal sacrifice hidden behind FDR's commanding presence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives and diving into these discussions with you. If you've enjoyed this journey into history's deepest shadows, make sure you don't miss the next one. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon so you're notified every time we post. There are countless more mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and we can't wait to explore them with you. Until next time, keep wondering.